There's an old warning that says, "The forest is a place of great power, while those who enter are either never seen again or leave forever changed." It's encouraging to me that others feel this way. It's obvious that forests have a powerful effect on people. Forests have sheltered humanity since before we were human, and it was through their resources that we have the societies we live in today. They are the inspiration behind many works of poetry, and they have been proven to reduce human stress levels.
But they don't just benefit us. They are also home to a multitude of species that have evolved alongside these woodlands. And as you probably know, trees are one of the keys to stopping some of the harmful effects of climate change, as they breathe in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. Pretty convenient, huh?
You are watching Beneath the Boughs, a story of how Ireland lost its forests, who took them, and what we can do to get them back.
So why Ireland? Well, this country was once almost completely covered in forest, and now it's not. Years ago, Ireland was just bare rock.
And a wall of ice half a mile thick. It covered the entire island and spilled onto the continental shelf. There was no room for life. This was the last glacial maximum. It ended as the Earth tilted and its orbit became closer to the sun. In a natural process we call them Milankovitch cycles. Slowly, the climate began to warm and the ice walls retreated north.
These new empty expanses of rock weren't empty for long, because soon after the ice retreated, new life advanced.
First on the scene were the algae, mosses, and lichens. They're the first to settle because they spread by spore, and those can be carried long distances by the wind. They don't have roots, so they're able to grow on surfaces like stone and wood, where other plants can't.
They were followed by bacteria, insects, and fungi, and together they did the hard work of breaking the bare rock down into soil.
It can take hundreds to thousands of years for the creation of soil, so botanical progress was slow.
But eventually, rush, sedges, and hardy grass species took root.
This landscape, which resembled a tundra biome, was home to reindeer, Irish elk, foxes, wolves, and bears. During this time, Ireland was a cold, treeless region. Far off in the distance, the retreating glaciers could be seen. This ecosystem is called the Mammoth Steppe, and was once one of the largest biomes on Earth.
15,000 years ago, the glacier's icy grip on the land had finally ended, and for the first time, life was able to advance north. However, progress was halted 12,300 years ago by a cold snap,
which rapidly reduced the diversity of vegetation and led to the extinction of the Irish elk, who could not adapt or escape quickly enough.
Around 11,700 years ago, the cold had finally ended, and a rapid warming period began. Now, on average, temperatures were between 30 and 60 degrees warmer than they are today. But this was actually perfect, because this allowed trees to finally move into Ireland. Before I get too ahead of myself, I want to explain how I know what was growing and when. It's spring in Ireland! The flowers are blooming, the trees are budding, and for some, this means allergies.
As you know, plants produce pollen, but not all of it makes it to your sinuses. Some will fall into bodies of water, and some actually makes it to other plants.
But it's the pollen that falls into these bodies of water that's most important to researchers, because as it settles, it's covered by organic material throughout the year, and once compressed, it creates layers. After a couple thousand years, a pattern starts to develop, like stripes on a shirt, that you can sample from.
These samples can be analyzed through a process called pollen grain analysis, where the pollen grains are matched to their species of origin and are radiocarbon dated to reveal when they were deposited in the water. But pollen grain analysis is just one of the ways we can understand the past. The other we'll be using is called dendrochronology. Here to explain it is Eleanor McKee.
Hi, Eleanor. What can you tell us about dendrochronology?
Dendrochronology is basically the study of tree history. What we do is we look at how trees grow in concentric rings, right? We take a line down the center that shows all those rings, and looking at the widths of them, different qualities about what they look like, we can tell almost everything that's happened in a tree's life. So if they experienced a fire or a drought or a particularly heavy growth season, we get to see all of that tracked in those rings. So it can tell us basically everything about the tree's life. We don't have to be there to experience what the tree experienced. It holds all that history within itself. So again, you can see fire events, droughts, even bug infestations. Different events like that are all tracked within the history of the tree. And we can use that to notice things about the environment changing around it, right? So if all the trees in a stand, which is like a group in a forest, all of them will kind of reflect the same events. So we can see again these bigger environmental changes happen through these big groups of trees. In the lab, what we're doing is building a database of trees from different areas and different stands across the country, and we're trying to use that information to figure out how the environment's changed in these places over the past 100 to 200 years.
By lining up these tree rings, you can read the past.
At the Queen's University in Belfast, researchers have assembled an unbroken timeline of oak tree rings that stretches back 7,308 years. They are able to take an oak sample from anywhere in Ireland, line it up with the rings on record, and find exactly when that tree sprouted and fell.
Through the pollen grain analysis and dendrochronology, we can know with certainty and confidence what was growing in the past.
The first tree to reach Ireland was the birch. Its small wing-like seeds are carried by birds and breeze alike, and it's quick to branch out into open spaces. The pollen record tells us that it was able to envelop Ireland in a very short amount of time.
The next tree to arrive in Ireland was the hazel, and for a while, it was the dominant species, with its pollen 17 times more abundant in the pollen record than any other tree species at that time. While they do grow fast, they don't grow very high, so a birch forest is the perfect cover for other species saplings, like hazel. Hazel is much more patient, and as the birch expands, the hazel grows taller, fills the canopy, and eventually chokes out the birch. Interestingly enough, this used to be a birch forest, but now, as you might have noticed, it's covered in hazel. Hazelnuts have long had an association with wisdom. Even the salmon of wisdom from Irish folklore was said to have gotten wise and fat off of the nuts that fell into its stream. Think about that next time you're scooping up some Nutella. Like all good things, Hazel's dynasty had to come to an end. It was eventually usurped by the three key players that we'll see later in this story: the Scots pine, the ash, and the oak. And I say the oak, but there were actually two different species. That'd be the pedunculate oak and the sessile oak, the latter of which is Ireland's national tree.
There were more than just the 5 original species out in the ancient forest, but the yew, alder, ash, holly, and apple had to play second fiddle for a while longer.
Between 9,000 and 10,000 years ago, Ireland would have been densely forested, 85% forested according to some estimations. And where the forest wasn't, salt marshes, wetlands, and bare rock stood.
These ancient forests would have been deep, dark, and wild. The trees had thousands of years to reign. The canopy was so dense, hardly any grasses or flowers grew in the understory. Thousands of years of deadwood, moss-covered, and rotting on the forest floor would have provided the stage for the huge diversity of fungi and insects that called this their home.
This is the landscape the first people would have seen when they wandered onto the island. Now, they most likely arrived by boat from Britain, and we know this because there are similar tools and settlements found there. And we know they lived along the coast at first. When we think of our early ancestors, we often think of someone who carried a club, lived in a cave, said ugh, and looked something like Marjorie Taylor Greene. But not only is just that plumb wrong, it's also extremely insulting to our early ancestors.
The Smithsonian's human evolutionary research suggests that we have existed as modern humans, or just like the ones we are today, for the last 100,000 years. This means that we have had the same capacity for thought, the ability to dream, love, and grieve since before we left Africa.
They were just as human as we are today, and maybe even more so. They were hunter-gatherers, and they arrived in Ireland around the middle of the Stone Age, or the Mesolithic era. Now, my stone tools aren't very good, but theirs would have been. Excavations of a Mesolithic settlement in Mount Sandel in County Derry show that the early Irish feasted on hazelnuts, fished for salmon and eel, and had tools strong enough to bring down the wild boar. Because of their reliance on the forest for survival, there was no clearing of the woodlands. The early Irish comfortably occupied their niche within the Irish ecosystem. The hunter-gatherer population is estimated at 5,000 to 10,000 at its peak. Their numbers were too small and their communities too scattered to make any disruption to the landscape.
4,000 years ago, the hunter-gatherers encountered something strange. Areas of forest had vanished, and in their place stood rows of golden plants. The farmers had arrived, and these new settlers planted seed crops and cereal grains. They had domesticated animals, and they cut down the forest using stone tools.
Their arrival marked a new era, the Neolithic era. Which took place at the latter half of the Stone Age. It also sparked a cultural shift from that of hunting and gathering to a culture almost solely based on agriculture.
The spread of farming traveled from the west of the island, where the Neolithic people first landed, onto the east. Food became more dependable and storable, which meant larger populations could be supported by these agricultural communities. As populations increased and farming spread, the need for timber and cleared lands increased with it. Woodland cover in Western Ireland fell from the near 85% from the Mesolithic to 70% by the end of the Stone Age. In the interior of the island, the forests remained at their full strength and were mostly untouched by Stone Age and Neolithic peoples. Towards the east, woodland cover was around 80 to 95% over the Neolithic era, largely because there were so few farmers. Although most of who they were was taken by time, we can still see a few monuments to their success. Many megalithic structures were originally built in the Stone Age, but others are true monuments of the Bronze Age. I'm headed to Knocknara in Sligo to show you one. Queen Maeve's cairn is the unopened and unexcavated passage grave on the summit of Knocknara Mountain in Sligo. A passage grave is a type of megalithic tomb characterized by a long, narrow passage leading to a burial chamber or chambers. It was built between 3500 and 3200 BCE and is one of the most impressive Neolithic monuments in Ireland. So who was Queen Maeve, and why is this cairn attributed to her? The legendary Queen Maeve ruled Kona from her palace at Rathcronan, which was at the centerpiece of Bronze Age monuments. Maeve is best known for her role in Tan Bo Covna, where she led her province to war against the Ulster, to take possession of the Brown Bull of Coley. She was buried according to tradition, standing upright within the chamber, wearing her armor and facing her ancient enemies in Ulster. Her tomb could not have been built without the thriving civilization she ruled over. In order to create something on this scale, way up here, you need to have specialists. Lesser developed societies would not have been able to spare the people for a project like this. They would be too busy collecting food or protecting their community. At this time, we know that the local economies were trade and barter based. Your wealth came from how many cattle you owned, or in Maeve's case, stole. Wars over cattle and the grain needed to feed the army shows us that the Bronze Age people cleared land for crops, but most importantly, they needed wide open spaces for grazing their cattle.
This era marked the beginning of a gradual transition from an island of forest to an island of pasture. As farming spread across the island, so did the clearing of forests, and just as it happened before, a new wave of people found themselves on Irish shores. Their cultures and technologies mixed with that of the locals, and the Bronze Age began. We call this era the Bronze Age because of the stunning metal objects that survived from this time. But this upgrade in technology could not have been possible without their reliance on the forests and the resources it provided. The Bronze Age Irish lived in wooden houses, with wooden fences. They used wood to heat their homes and cook their food. They used wood to fuel the furnaces that brought them into the Bronze Age, and wood was used in everyday aspects like arrows, axe handles, parts of sword making, and just about everything else.
It's important to mention that there wasn't a single clearance event. Instead, there was a gradual decline in forest and scrub cover. This was done mostly by people, but the climate also had a role to play.
Well, the climate with its warming and cooling allowed for some tree species to be in the spotlight for brief moments. Species like the Scots pine, ash, and oak did very well during these warming events. However, the warming events that made growing cereal crops in the North Atlantic possible eventually came to an end, and these cooler spells aided in the growth of bogs. Now, these bogs had been expanding since the late Neolithic, but their interactions with humans were just getting worse. So, what is a bog? Well, a bog is a wetland ecosystem characterized by its slightly acidic water. And the slightly acidic water means that the dissolved oxygen content within that water is very, very low. And without dissolved oxygen, decomposition is very difficult to do. This means that the bog acts like a pickle brine for anything or anyone unfortunate enough to become a permanent fixture in its ecosystem. Because of their nature as wetlands, they exist in low-lying areas and silently invade outward from there. Under the water are layers of organic material called peat. Throughout Ireland's past and even up until present day, peat is extracted for a variety of uses.
Peat is the dried bottom of ancient bogs. People and artifacts that fill in are often accidentally discovered by peat cutters, who excavate these dried bogs.
It's through this extraction of peat that we are given a unique peek into the life of an early Bronze Age person. For this segment, we will be discussing and showing human remains. If that's going to turn your stomach, I suggest you skip ahead or go on your phone if you haven't already.
Bog bodies either make you sick or put you at the edge of your seat. Fortunately for me, they put me in the Museum of Irish Archaeology in Dublin, specifically in the Kingship and Sacrifice Wing.
As the name suggests, and as you may have already put together, many of these bodies are thought to be sacrifices. But why sacrifice a perfectly good body to a bog?
Think about this from their perspective for a moment. The warm summers and large harvests you grew up knowing are becoming rare. It's getting cooler and darker. The crops you and your family depend on for survival are failing. The dark pools of bog are getting closer every year, and any land they touch dies. Communities were looking for answers. Sacrificing people to the bog seems to be the thing that scratched that itch. Throughout Bronze Age Europe, there are numerous examples of people dying violent deaths in bog ecosystems. While we can't say that all of them were sacrifices, it is interesting that they all started and ended around the same time. We know now that it was the acidity of the water that was swallowing farmland and forest. But we can't just blame the cooling climate. The clearing of forest by the Neolithic took its toll on the land. The lack of trees allowed bogs to form in some areas. The Irish Peatland Society estimates that peatland, or bog cover, in the Bronze Age was about 16.2% of the country. It was a change in climate and human actions that led these people to their end.
Forests, as you know, were used in every aspect of daily life, and the farmlands provided the food and the cattle that made these civilizations wealthy. But it's not just people you can find in the depths of these bogs. Remember when I said it swallowed up forests too? Well, it's true, and the wood found in these bogs is not only rare, it's also very beautiful. The Chapel Royal in Dublin features bog oak as a key part of its interior design to showcase the wealth, craftsmanship, and beauty of this establishment. It's estimated that woodland cover drops by over 30% during the Bronze Age. But like most things, deforestation in Ireland was not a linear process. Plots of land that were cleared for agriculture were abandoned as the soil quality was degraded. And this gave the woods a vital opportunity to rebound. There were also new tree species, because people migrating to Ireland brought with them their favorite tree and shrub species from home. It was around 4,000 years ago that the strawberry tree was introduced. In Ireland, it's referred to as the Killarney strawberry tree. It's most common in the southern parts of the island, where the first people bringing it over would have planted it. But its species originated in the Mediterranean. Also introduced at this time were the walnut and sycamore, and now they're common hedgerow plants.
With heavy weather approaching, I headed back. And just in time, too. The new people reached Irish shores. The cultural advances they brought with them went on to describe the Irish for centuries to come. These were, of course, the Celts. And what they brought to Ireland was iron. The earliest written reference of these people comes from 500 BC, when Hecataeus of Miletus, a Greek geographer, references Colti in his work. Now, the Celts did not call themselves Celt. That label was given to them by the Greeks and Romans who encountered these people and their new metal. Sir Barry Cunliffe, a former professor of European archaeology at the University of Oxford, theorizes that Celts were some of the first masters of iron, and it may have been their mastery of this metal that awarded them the title Celt. Everywhere the Romans ran into people with iron, in their eyes, they were running into Celts. But it wasn't just iron that these people had in common. There was also a shared culture. At this time in Irish history, nothing was written down. There was no need. News, legends, histories, they were all told within the community and maintained by oral tradition. Unfortunately, for research purposes, we have to turn to people who did write stuff down to know what the Celts were up to. Some of the earliest references made to the Celts directly come from 60 AD, when a Roman called Tactius is writing about the Roman campaign on Anglesey, just off the coast of Wales. In this work, he describes how imperial troops destroyed a Celtic sacred grove that was, in his words, devoted to barbarous superstitions. It was their religion, he writes, to drench their altars in the blood of prisoners and consult their gods by means of human entrails. The Roman poet Marcus Annius Lucanus, better known to us now as Lucan, was working for Julius Caesar. He famously composed Pharsala, the epic poem about the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, which occurred in about 60 CE. In one of the two books he wrote for Caesar, he included a poem about a strange druid grove in Gaul, in modern France, where the trees were adorned with human blood and entrails. Yet another account, this time by the Greek historian Strabo, who wrote in the 1st century, gives us a different view. He writes, "The Galatians would assemble a council of 300 men to pass judgment on common issues. Their assembly place? Dry Nemetanium. To us now, this would be Dru Nemeton, which translates to something like oak sanctuary, with Nemeton meaning sanctuary and Dru meaning oak." Some scholars argue that the word druid comes from this root, dru meaning oak and wid meaning to know. However, there is no archaeological proof anywhere that the Druids were a part of a separate culture than that of the surrounding people. In fact, the evidence suggests that these people were council people or clergy, possibly even a noble class of the early Irish. These Latin commentaries on the Celts and their culture indicate that they did not construct permanent temples, but that they chose to worship in the open air, most frequently in sacred groves. We know that trees played an important and sacred part in Ireland at this time. Legends tell of Carib Usni, an ash at Usni, which was considered the ancient sacred center of Ireland. It's in County Westmeath, which was a political and cosmological center of its community. It's said it could shelter 1,000 warriors under its branches, and that it stretched 32 kilometers into the air.
This legendary 19.8-mile tall ash would have been the axis mundi, the connection between heaven and earth around which all else spun. Now this legend shows us two very important things. First, it shows us the importance the ancient people put on individual trees. And second, it highlighted the strength and power that these individual trees held.
The early kings, clan leaders, and chieftains are said to have held their coronations at these sacred trees. The Slá Anna Reina, or rod of kingship, which would have been something like a staff or a scepter, was often said to be cut from this sacred tree and bestowed upon the new leader, to symbolize their marriage between the land and its people. In Peter Bairnsford Ellis's book, A Dictionary of Irish Mythology, he writes that each Irish clan or confederation held a sacred tree. These trees were vital to the communities because they were considered the Can na Preha, or trees of life. Many rituals and community events would have centered around these landmarks. These ancient lords of the wood were held in high esteem. They were badges of pride within their communities. It was their very significance, to Ellis's point, that put them as a target for attack. The felling of trees by rival clans was done during an invasion, and it was intended to demoralize and humiliate them. They fell their sacred tree of Brennathala. In the year 1111, the Ullid sought their revenge when an expedition was made to Tala Oak, the sacred forest of the Kennel Owen, and fell the grove of sacred trees. A later 8th century law text called the Judgments of Neighborhoods suggests that there was a stratification of trees in the ancient forest. The highest of these trees were the nobles of the wood: oak, hazel, holly, yew, ash, Scots pine, and apple. According to this text, a branch cutting taken from one of these lords of the wood would cost you a year-old heifer. Now you have to remember that the economic system in Iron Age Ireland was set up primarily about the trade and barter around cattle. So a year-old heifer, along with the next few fines, was pretty serious. A fork cutting would cost you 2-year-old heifers, and a base cutting would cost you a milk cow. Now, these injury-specific fines were paid on top of a fine of 2 milk cows. It was also around this time that the early Iron Age people began attributing specific uses to particular trees. The Roman historian Plinthi wrote in regard to the Celts, "They choose groves formed of oak for the sake of the tree alone, and they never perform any of the rites except in the presence of a branch of it." Later, a 9th century text on legal commentary explains to us how these nobles of the wood were used within their communities. It explains that ash was used to make hurleys, spear shafts, furniture, oak, and oars. Many durable daily use items came from ash. Apple was used, of course, for its fruits, and interestingly, holly makes this list, despite being more of a shrub than a tree. Holly's importance was due to its use during the winter as a fodder for livestock. Oaks were also prized for their acorns, which was the staple of the autumn diet for pigs. The wood of the oak was almost never used at this time. Yew was also prized as a sacred tree alongside the oak. It was important for both pagan and early Christian peoples, but its wood was also sacred. It was the only wood used by the early Christians to make staves, watertight vessels used in everyday life. We also have to remember that during this time, metal was rare, glass was impossible, ceramics had fallen out of style, and stone was very difficult for daily use. It was lumber and its uses that kept these people warm, housed, and fed, just as it had been doing for the past 7,000 years. Wood was still being used to build houses, fences, furniture, tools, their handles, boats for fishing and travel, yokes, chariots, bridges, and most other things. But the main cause for forest clearing was again grazing land for livestock. The land covered by forests had declined to about 50% by the peak of the Bronze Age. As technologies continued in advance, and axes went from stone to bronze to iron, the landscape declines with each advance in technology and civilization. By the mid-Iron Age, the woodlands had taken a beating. Estimated forested land during the Iron Age is difficult to determine. Large areas of forest were cleared around community settlements, but in other areas of the country, large areas were growing back. I maintain that the deforestation of Ireland was not a linear event. Lands abandoned after wars, plagues, and throughout soil degradation become young forests and scrubland again. Given enough time, forests can fully rebound and reclaim cleared areas, only to be cleared again later by different people. The Iron Age Irish lived in relative peace. Their pastoral and farming communities took part in worship in sacred forests. Their laws and language kept the lands in peace. New advances in metalwork allowed for kings and clan chieftains to rise to power. The forest resources that made all of this possible was in somewhat of a sustainable state. An equilibrium between reliance and regrowth had taken shape. Then something ominous washed onto the Irish shore.
Next week, we'll take a look at Ireland's invaders and understand what their presence did to the landscape. This has been Roots of Ireland. Thank you for watching.